Gone.
Okay. So I'm Chad Utter with CB Tech, one of the welding teachers here, and Mr. Oliver is our other teacher. Today we're going to talk about the Oxy Acetylene machine or setup, and we'll talk about some of the terminology that we use, what parts you need to get an Oxy Acetylene system running. This is one of the older methods of welding and metalworking, using the oxygen and an acetylene tank to create a flame hot enough to melt metal and fuse it together, or melt metal and cut it. And so we'll talk about a lot of the different things. If you don't know how to use an oxyacetylene torch and you work in a welding shop, then you're just a welder, or you're just a machinist, or you're just a something. You're not a metal worker. You're just a dude that can do one thing, or a gal that can do one thing. So you need to learn how to use an oxyacetylene torch properly. Very handy. In the big scheme of things, very inexpensive. Everybody can afford to, if you have a welding shop, you can afford a system like this, and you can do a lot of things with it. You can weld with it, you can cut with it, you can heat things up to bend with it, you can do a lot of stuff. So let's just get right into what we're working with here. So green tank is always oxygen. Well, always in our shop, oxygen. Red tank in our shop is always acetylene. Sometimes the bottle color is different depending on manufacturers, but for what we do, red is acetylene, green is oxygen. If you're confused about what kind of metal or what kind of gas you're working with, they always have a sticker, and that sticker has what the gas is. This one says oxygen. This tank back here on the back is a red sticker, says acetylene. They come in different sizes. This is the most common for what we do in our shop, but you can get miniature ones. You can have, what we have out back is we have manifolds where we gang several bottles together and pipe it into the building, so you can do it lots of different ways. But we're going to talk about this portable setup today. When you have a portable setup, the key that you have to remember, that you have to do, is you have to have a chain or some way to secure these bottles onto this cart. I'm going to post a link to a Mythbusters video that talks about tank safety a little bit and shows you why you need to have these chained. These things are supercharged when they're full and new. An oxygen tank has 2,200 pounds of pressure, which is a lot of pressure, and you'll see that in the video. Acetylene tanks, I think, run around 500 pounds of pressure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Okay, so you've got a cart with wheels with a chain to keep these things intact. If one of these tanks falls off and breaks the valve off or somehow punctures the bottle, which is highly unlikely but could happen, you're going to have a rocket on your hands that you're not going to be able to control. So, bad deal, but that's in the video. Okay, so some things that you have to have in order to make this system work. First off, you've got the tanks. You've got to make sure they've got gas in them, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. But on top of the tank, this is the valve, okay? And this is how you let the gas, turn the gas on or turn the gas off, whether you're talking oxygen or acetylene. Then you've got a regulator, and a regulator regulates how much gas comes out of the tank, whether it's oxygen or whether it's the acetylene. Because, and if you're brand new to this, you know that you cannot weld with 2,200 pounds of pressure. So you need to regulate that down to a working pressure. And Victor, which is our system, or Victor's, this is a Victor torch. There's a chart, and I'll post that chart. You'll be able to see it. So it kind of tells you how much pressure you need to work with depending on what it is you're doing. If you're cutting, your oxygen might be a little higher. If you're welding, your pressures change. And then when we start talking about tips, different tips require different pressures as well. So you'll be able to read that and then figure out what you need. So you have to have a regulator to allow the right amount of oxygen or acetylene, or another similar, sometimes it's an oxypropane if you wanted to go that route. We don't have that set up here, but that is another common one. Okay, then you've got a set of hoses. These are flame resistant hoses. Doesn't mean they can't have any problems. Like this hose right here, if you notice there's been a hot spark on it at one point, which didn't burn through, but those are things you want to avoid at all costs. So you've got a set of hoses. They come in varying lengths. This is probably about a 15 or 20 foot hose, which is more than enough for most people, but sometimes on a mobile rig, if you've got a setup on a pickup, you might have these hoses run out a lot longer than this. Attached to the hoses, and then just a little side note, on the hoses themselves, you see you've got you've got a nut on the green hose is always oxygen, red hose is always fuel, whether that's propane or gas. And then if you notice on the fuel hose, there's a little notch in the thread. And that notch in the thread means that this is reverse thread. So gas does not have a notch, so this is regular thread, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. The fuel side on your fuel line is reverse thread, meaning just the opposite. So right is loose and left is tight. So that's important to know, and it's a safety feature that allows you to, well, it does not allow you to hook the wrong hose to the wrong side of the torch. Okay, so that's pretty important to know. Same goes for where the regulator attaches to the tank. The fuel side is reverse thread. The gas oxygen side is regular thread. Okay, so attached to this then we have the torch body. And what a torch body does is it regulates how much oxygen, how much acetylene come in. You've got these two valves on here to allow however much you want to allow to go through. When we get to the different torches and the uses, which will be in the next video segment, we'll talk about how far to turn these things on. And it depends on what you're doing. If you're cutting, you're going to turn them on a certain amount. If you're welding, you're going to turn them on a certain amount. And then you've got the mixing chamber, where the two gases, the oxygen and the fuel, whether it's propane or acetylene, mix in here to the right parts to get the flame that you want. And then on the end of this, you have a welding tip, okay? In this case, this is a welding tip. But over here on the table, we've got a bunch of different types of tips that you can use. We have a cutting torch head. This you'd use for cutting. With the cutting head, we've got different sizes of tips, and you probably can't see those from where you're at, but on that chart, it talks about, different size tips for different thicknesses of metal, different heats, different gases, things like that. And so we've got a pretty good size tip. These have really been used up and dirty, but this is a 3, which will cut a lot thicker metal than, say, a 1 or a 0. Okay? So that's a cutting torch. Then we've got a cutting torch with a different type of tip. This is if you look at it, it's bent. You can see it's got a bend to it, which some people would say, oh, let's just throw that away. It's bent, it's garbage. That's not the case at all. This is a gouging tip. And if you wanted to scarf off some, like a weld, if you wanted to lay this torch at an angle like this, flat on a piece of metal, and cut the top of a weld off, or if you wanted to kind of gouge out a fillet weld or something, these work very well for just removing or carving off a little bit of metal. So that's a cutting torch with a little bit different tip. We've got a couple different sizes of welding tip here. Actually, I think I got 3 sizes of welding tip, maybe just 2. We've got a size 1, and we've got a size 3. And if you look at the chart, that Victor chart, it'll tell you what thickness of material these work best for. The bigger the tip, the thicker the material. And then the last tip that we've got is what we call a rosebud tip. And this tip is just used for heating. Like if you wanted to bend a piece of material, if you needed to heat something up to make it move, if you were trying to remove a frozen bearing or something. Sometimes you would heat up that bearing so it expands and then be able to pound it off a shaft or something like that. We have, Mr. Oliver mostly, has used one of these at one point. And we had some students years ago. They were brazing something really big and using several braze rods at a time, and used a rosebud tip to heat the material to accept that metal. So that's a technique that's not usually taught in schools, but we'll do it anyway, okay? And then one of the most important things that you're going to need to become a good oxyacetylene welder or cutter is a set of tip cleaners. And these tip cleaners are just a bunch of little files and a little flat file and a little bunch of real small round files. And in order to do a good quality job welding or cutting, you need to have a clean tip. And so you use the right-sized file for the tip that you've got. And you want it to slide in there. You know, you don't want it real loose in there, but you certainly don't want to have to force it and make it tight. So you find the right size file for that, file off the surface so that it's nice and true. You want a nice flat surface, sharp edges on that orifice for cutting. Okay, you've got a striker. The only way you light a torch is with a striker. You don't use a match, you don't use a cigarette lighter, you don't use somebody else welding on the side. You don't stick your torch over there and blow it up in their face. You use a striker for lighting that. One of the reasons you don't use a lighter or matches, because that means that you've got a lighter or matches in your pocket or somewhere on your person, and if you're holding that lighter in your front pocket and you get a hot spark on that lighter, you can think about the damage. So then we have welding or cutting goggles. Okay, and these are specifically for oxyacetylene work, whether you're brazing, whether you're cutting. Three things that look different, but they do the exact same thing. These are a shade 5 lens, which means these are darker than sunglasses, okay, but lighter than a welding helmet. And so when we talk about welding, we talk about different shades of lens, and if you're using the proper shade for the job, it makes your life a lot easier. So if you've got too light of a shade, you're going to damage your eyes because of the brightness, or it's going to just blind you and you're not going to be able to see exactly what you're doing or exactly what your torch is doing. And if you can't see it, you're just guessing. And if you're guessing, you're not a welder. Okay? These ones here, they fit nicely over a pair of safety glasses. These ones fit pretty nice over a pair of safety glasses. You know, so you can pick your preference. Doesn't really matter which ones you use, but the fact is you need to use them when you're oxyacetylene welding or cutting. Visibility is the key, and having the proper shade, shade 5 is what it is. Most sunglasses probably run 2 or 3, shade 2 or 3. Most of the time when we're doing an arc welding procedure, we're using a shade 10. You know, sometimes a little bit higher than that, depending on the intensity of the light, the amount of voltage you're using, all that stuff. So, voltage and amperage. So anyway, shade 5 for oxyacetylene glasses, make sure you use them. Okay, I think that's about covering the setup and the stuff that we've got for oxyacetylene. The next segment, like I said, will be on how to start the torch, how to shut down the torch, just to start up and shut down, and we'll call her good.